We're really thrilled to have James Howell with us today. He's the clinic lead at Carbon Health, and he is definitely an expert. He's been an MA for 13 years. So thank you so much, James, for being here. We're going to talk about a really important topic, which is implicit bias. So take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Vicky. Now, before you ask what is implicit bias, I have a little activity that we can go ahead and start so we can kind of get the gist of it. We're going to do a matching game. Here are 6 categories: Great British Bake Off Judge, Screenwriter, Surgeon General, First LGBTQ Artist to Win a Country Music Award, Protester Killed in Kenosha Shooting, and President of New Zealand. Now I'm going to be showing a few photos and see if you could go ahead and match any of these to those categories. I'll give you a couple of seconds here. And here we go with the answers. Which ones do you get right? So we have Paul Hollywood, Shonda Rhimes, a screenwriter, Jerome Adams, Lil Nas X, he's the LGBTQ artist who won a country award, Joseph Rosenbaum, and Jacinda Ardern, who would be the president of New Zealand.
So I got Paul Hollywood because I'm a Great British Bake Off fan. And Shonda Rhimes, I mean, who doesn't know Shonda Rhimes? She's like amazing. Jerome Adams was the Surgeon General. I'll be honest, when I think of country music, I automatically think of like an old white person, and so that was new for me.
Surprise.
And then Jacinda Ardern, yeah, you're right, President of New Zealand, at least for a time. I know she's retiring soon, but
Yeah, in general, like I would think president probably male.
Yeah,
That's my
yeah.
little implicit bias there.
Yeah.
And those are some examples. Now, here are some definitions that we're going to go ahead and go through really quickly. We have stereotype, which are just basically ideas or generalizations that we have on a whole entire group of people or just an individual person.
Some stereotypes that I like to think of are like tall people are good at basketball, or women are natural caregivers, or snakes are venomous, right? That's a stereotype. Not all snakes are venomous, but we stereotype them all as like a venomous group. So,
Absolutely. So we have prejudice, which is basically an idea or judgment or feeling towards somebody without actual sufficient evidence towards that person or group. Discrimination, clearly unfair negative treatment towards a group of people or of different categories. This could be like the LGBT community, race, things like that. Then we have bias, which is just an inclination or tendency idea towards something or someone. All right, here we go. We're going to go through the types of biases. And here we have explicit bias. And these are just thoughts or beliefs, ideas that we might have about a person or a group or in general that we bring to a conscious level. And this could be a choice or an idea that we already know of.
so an example of my explicit bias is that I have an explicit bias for Starbucks over Dunkin' Donuts. So, right, that's a stupid example, but that is a conscious thing that I act on every single day when I pass the very close Dunkin' Donuts to my house and go right to Starbucks.
Absolutely. That's a very good example.
Yeah.
And here we have implicit bias. Now, these are ideas that are underlined in the back of our heads on our unconscious level that we develop over time. We learn these from our social circles, our parents, media, social media, and that can have an impact on our behavior and judgment. And it also could conflict with your own declared beliefs, like I think everyone is great, but then somehow you generalize a certain group of people.
So taking my Dunkin' Donuts Starbucks example, I could say, if you asked me, Vicky, do you have a preference for type of coffee chain? I could say, oh no, I like all of them equally. But if my actions, the fact that I pass that Dunkin' Donuts to go to Starbucks, or I'm constantly talking about Starbucks or offering Starbucks to people over other things, even though my declared belief is that, oh, they're all great, my actions show that I have an implicit bias towards Starbucks.
So from what you're saying is implicit bias is invisible.
Exactly, it's unconscious. We don't even know about it. Yep.
Yeah, that's right, Amanda. Most of us, we generally don't even know that we're doing them, but we do them anyway, and it's basically not our fault. The best thing about implicit bias is that they're changeable. We actually can learn how to undo them or bring more focus and acknowledgement to them, so that way we can better manage our emotions or control our behavior. When it comes to implicit bias, healthcare workers are no exception to the rule. We may display implicit biases similarly to everybody else in the general population. And that definitely can affect how we treat and manage our patients. And we want to make sure that we are aware of this.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think a lot of us go into healthcare. It's an altruistic field. We want to be helping people. And so I think we might hear that and be like, oh no, there's no way. Like, I'm doing this to help people. I treat everybody fairly. So I'm glad that you shed some light on that. That even though we are in healthcare, we're doing the right thing, we're trying to help people, we all still have our own implicit biases that we need to be aware of.
Yes, definitely. And there are certain patients that typically would experience these implicit biases more often. It could be their age, or people's race or ethnicity, gender, or any kind of health issue that they might have. And we generally like to keep those in mind before we treat the patient, so that way we don't treat them unfairly.
And even in a healthcare setting, we like to call sometimes our patients frequent flyers. And that's kind of our implicit bias in healthcare. We have patients that come into the clinic repetitively, and we kind of have a bias against them. Maybe they really do need care. They obviously are here. So I would just like to point that out as well.
Yeah, that's true. Right. We could say like, well, we treat everybody the same way, but when we see this person on the board and they've been here every week for the last year, we may have some feelings about them that are unconscious, and then we may treat them based on those feelings. So yeah, I'm really glad that that's so common. I'm really glad you pointed
Yeah,
that out.
definitely. And it might come often, but you don't have to assume why they're coming. And I generally like to just assume positive intent, that they're coming in basically for a new reason. And we just have to approach it that way, even though they come a lot often than usual, the other patients, but we want to treat them fairly just as well. Now, when it comes to patient care, implicit bias can have a major impact on how we treat our patients. It could affect providers' attitudes and beliefs and medical assistants, how we treat the patient, how we manage activities, and my most important one, patient satisfaction.
I'm so glad that you brought these up. And I want to highlight or give an example of the management one. So, studies have shown that Black and Latinx patients, both children and adults, were less likely to receive pain medication, especially an opioid, for a pain condition in the emergency department. So, these implicit biases that we have toward those patient populations can impact and do impact and contribute to racial healthcare disparities. So, this is why it's so important for us to acknowledge the fact that we have these because they impact our patients in a big way.
Absolutely. And it also can affect the workplace, how we do hiring, promotions, recognitions. Pay is a big one. I know there's a difference between like male and female pay rates, and that's usually the obvious example. And interactions with your own coworkers, and we'll just dive right into microaggressions. These could be um, geared towards like a specific role. You would assume that a nurse would be female, or the male would be the doctor, but it could also be vice versa. Commenting out on how pretty someone is or how they perform a certain task given their race or gender, or crossing the street and clutching belongings in the presence of individuals. Stepping onto an elevator and kind of moving to the side is another example of that.
So, another example I'd like to add is the working mom mentality. So, a lot of times we assume that working moms don't have the effort and time to put into work, which is an invalid assumption.
Mm-hmm.
And there are, fortunately, strategies to reduce the impact of these implicit bias. As we stated before, implicit bias can be changed and acknowledged, and we'll be able to direct our behavior effectively. Here is an acronym that we can dive right into really quickly. We have introspection, mindfulness, perspective taking, learn to slow down, individuation, check your messaging, institutionalize fairness, and take two. Introspection, basically just taking a look inside of yourself to kind of determine where your implicit bias exists. There are also like many tests that you can take to kind of explore where those implicit biases are coming from, and then that can kind of help direct your behavior and treatment towards patients or coworkers in general.
So there's a website and organization called Project Implicit where you can go. We'll put a link to that website in the written summary of this video. And it's a great place where you can take a test that can help identify your own implicit biases. So if we think back to that list that you shared with us about patient characteristics that healthcare workers tend to have biases about, you could take a test for that. So you could take a test about gender or about disabilities. So it's a great way to identify your own bias.
Definitely. And once they're identified, then you'll be able to keep in mind or be mindful when under pressure, you might want to employ your own implicit bias or cognitive shortcuts. And so when you already know your implicit bias, it's kind of easier to be mindful and take your time and just go around that and just make sure that you are modifying coping ability and your biological reactions. Our next one is perspective taking, or as I like to call it, just putting yourself in other people's shoes. A lot of times we are already able to identify a stereotyped individual, so we can go ahead and get out of our comfort zone, engage face-to-face interactions with them, and kind of take the time to see where they're coming from and kind of detail their care from that point. And with your increased knowledge of your own implicit bias, it's always a good idea to step back, pause, think, and acknowledge before you react or take action. Also, we want to get to know each patient as an individual. We all have our certain attributes that might tie us to a certain stereotype. We're going to separate them so that way we could provide the best care and acknowledge the patient as an individual outside of those stereotypes. And with such a diverse cultural world that we live in, we want to make sure that we check our messaging. Make sure that we're inclusive in our environment and embracing and welcoming. And that includes body language or using the correct pronouns that the patient prefers to go by. Those are very important to ensure the patient's care. Individual action is not enough. And to institutionalize fairness, organizations are the ones that are responsible for fostering the culture and diversity. At my program or at my company, we use diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and that sets the tone of how we should proceed with handling these types of diverse situations. And always remember, the work doesn't stop there. It requires continual revision and reflection. And we want to go ahead and take two and make sure that our implicit biases doesn't stop us from giving the intended care to our patients. In summary, self-reflection is the major takeaway from this. As one of my personal heroes, Michael Jackson, said, take a look at yourself and make the change. Self-reflection is key to identifying your own biases and how to overcome them and to provide optimal care. Ladies, do you have anything to add?
Well, first of all, I think now that song is going to be stuck in her head. So thanks. It's a great song, but
You're
now it's going to
welcome.
be stuck in her head. I think the point that we made earlier about just don't assume just because you're working in healthcare that you don't have an implicit bias. So we all have implicit biases. Everybody does, regardless of whether you work in healthcare or not. And then just understanding that those biases impact how we care for patients.
And we should also be using the implicit acronym to look at our own implicit bias as well.
This is Hippo Education.